Welcome to the debut episode of a brand new AVA Movement interview series. My name is Adam Barnard, and today I'm thrilled to welcome Angels Airwaves producer, engineer, and mixer Aaron Rubin. Aaron, thank you for generously cutting out some time today to talk to us.
No problem. Happy to be here.
So I just want to go ahead and start at the beginning with you, and not just the beginning of Angels and Airwaves, but really the genesis of your musical career. Can you just walk us through, how you picked up instruments and started to get interested in music, and kind of what bands personally were your heroes growing up that got you inspired to be a producer?
Well, going back about 39 years, I was always somewhat musically, I wouldn't say musically inclined, but I was really into music. My mom used to say that the only thing that would shut me up was putting me in front of a TV, watching, MTV. And, MTV was born about a year after me. So I grew up watching MTV religiously. It wasn't cartoons. It wasn't anything like that. It was always MTV. And it was all throughout the day, whether it's the top 20 countdown or, Headbangers Ball, and then even Yo MTV Raps. I think, what was great about that is that you were able to just get this background on music. It doesn't matter. They would play In Excess and then into Bobby Brown and then into Def Leppard and then into, LL Cool J, and you're oh my God, this is crazy. Whereas I'm not even sure that you can get an experience quite like that, because it was always just the new music of the time. It didn't matter what genre it really was. Later on, it started becoming more genre specific, and they'd be oh, here's Alternative Nation, or here's this show that deals with this kind of music. And then in the 90s, it started getting more into other programming as well. But by the time that came out, I had already started messing around, recording. My dad had a very early MIDI rig, so it didn't even matter if it was just sounds on a keyboard and putting stuff together. I was always really interested in what artists call as doodling, is that. And then it wasn't until high school I started playing guitar around the age of 14. I started playing drums around the age of 12. And then it wasn't until my senior year of high school that I started a band. And, it was kind of just a battle of the bands type thing. And little by little, it turned into a real band. And we started playing real shows and opening up for real bands and blah, 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 blah. Met a lot of people. Then kind of went from that band into a band called Denver Harbor. And that was Ilan and I, who Ilan was in that high school band that I spoke of. And he started that when he was I believe he was either 8 or 9. But then him and I started a band with Will from Phoenix TX and Chris Lewis, who had jumped into Phoenix TX. And we did this band called Denver Harbor and got signed to a label, to Universal. And, were dropped about a year later because of kind of how the major label game works, where they just kind of, they play roulette. So it's they put their chips out on a bunch of bands, and then whichever band hits, they keep the money on and then just kind of wipe away all the other bands. And then after that, I was just kind of all right, what am I really going to do with my life here? Am I going to, go and start another band, or am I going to go try to join a band, or what's the end game here? So I decided that I wanted to get into the other side of the music industry and, be more on the management or label or whatever. I just wasn't completely sure. But the stuff that I gravitated to was mostly management. And at that time, Ilan started getting calls to join other bands. And, I kind of said, you know what? You're the musician for sure. You have the talent. I'll manage you. And that was that. I mean, that's kind of my foray into management. And, as far as recording goes, when I kind of made that step, I still wanted to keep on quote unquote doodling and I had a 16 track recorder that was like a digital recorder, and we kind of just started adding stuff to the studio just so I can write and record stuff, but not necessarily to ever put it out. It was just kind of for me, like just being creative and getting ideas out onto tape, if you will. And little by little, when Ilan wanted to experiment and start doing the new regime, his question was, what do we need to be able to record a full album here in our garage, which is, a studio now. And, we put a little list together, and we went out, got all the stuff that we needed, and we recorded that first New Regime album. And then, other bands that I was managing were just like, well, why don't we just record our album with you? I mean, the New Regime stuff sounds great. And I was like, sure. So, I missed the part where I started managing some other bands and whatnot. But yeah, that happened. And little by little, it just became an income stream for me as opposed to just kind of my hobby. And me recording stuff for myself stopped happening because I was just, between managing Ilan and these other bands and, recording stuff for Ilan and these other bands, I was like, there was never any time for me. But that's okay, because when I work with bands, I really dive deep into the creative process, and I think I kind of get that box ticked off for me, the creativity box, working with other people. It's almost reading a sentence and saying, okay, no, let's add these two words, take this out, add a comma here, and it's like, now we have a great sentence. Even though what you're trying to say is essentially the same. It's like you're able to kind of doll things up and kind of make whatever they're trying to say, 5% better, 10% better, sometimes 50% better. You never know. And so that's kind of like a quick little bio as to like my musical background and management, and then I'll let you ask some more questions and see where you want to go from there.
Yeah, right. I mean, before we dive into the Angels and Airwaves stuff, like, how did you learn sound engineering? I mean, was it just something you were around, or, there's a lot of technical depth to engineering, and to engineer at your level, you had to have learned a lot of that somewhere. Were you mentored by anyone, or was it just a lot of research, watching tutorials, experimenting? How did you learn how to produce, essentially?
Well, one of my best friends is a producer engineer. His name is Joe Marlette, and he's done stuff like Reliant K. He engineered on Queens of the Stone Age, did some Foo Fighters stuff, and Switchfoot. And we've always had a really great relationship. And that being said, in the bands that I've been in, I've always really enjoyed being in the studio and watching and asking questions and seeing how people do things and what mics they use and, yada, yada, yada. So a lot of it came from like, making phone calls to Joe and being like, hey, how do I do this? But a lot of those questions were mainly, philosophical or like stupid Pro Tools questions like, why am I getting this error? Or how do I get it to do this or that or whatever? And it's just a matter of being aware of your surroundings and how people do stuff and being in the studio. And because we were friends, he was recording a lot of my friends' bands as well. And, I'd be in the studio and kind of watch him go in and see him set up and blah, blah, blah. And then when we started doing the New Regime stuff, a lot of it was just trial and error. Like, okay, how do we get this to sound right? And it's like, all right, let's just go and I learn by doing mostly. I'm not like I've never read a manual for anything. I just don't have the bandwidth to like sit there and read stuff and then try to hold all that information in, because it's like, if I'm dealing with something that has 10 buttons on it, I'm just like, what, I'm not going to be able to know what they all are unless I start working on it. So yeah, a lot of it was that. And then a lot of it was also, reading online forums or Googling stuff, or, once YouTube came out, it was like all these things would come out and you'd be like, oh, interesting. And even if it's stuff that seems super basic, like I've watched like hundreds of videos of like how to set up and mic up a drum kit. And sure, most of them are 95% the same,
Right.
But every once in a while, you'll get something where it's like, huh, that's interesting. I'll try that on the next session. Sometimes it works great. Sometimes it doesn't work, but it's always it's always good to have something in your back pocket. Like, hey, I want to try doing this in my next session and kind of just see if it works or not.
For sure.
And between doing demos and recording albums, doing the demos really gives you the opportunity to experiment, because it's like, who cares? Worst case scenario, we know it's not going to get used. And if it doesn't sound great, it is what it is. We tried it. And if it sounds great, then it's like, oh man, this is going to be amazing to try to, on the album. But I've just found that so many things like are determined by the player, the room that you're in, especially like with things like drums and whatnot, and, the talent you're working with. And I've been very, very fortunate to, be recording Ilan, who can play anything at a 10. Like, we spend more time finding a sound than actually tracking the part, which is insane to me. Other times I'll be with, other players where it's like, okay, it took me 25 minutes to get this guitar sound, and it's taking me an hour to track a 3-minute song because the playing is just not there, or it's just giving up and saying, I'm just going to edit the shit out of that later. And those are the sessions that I'm not, I don't really care for doing. And
Sure.
I'm fortunate that right now I'm busy enough with Tom and Ilan on all of their different projects that I'm completely comfortable not doing much more than that unless it's something I really want to do. And, that's a great position to be in, I think.
Yeah. No, that's awesome. I want to ask about how the working relationship started with you and Angels and Airwaves. I know Ilan joined the band, I think, fall of 2011, and not long after he joined the band, Critter, the Tom's producer and engineer for the first 4 albums, tragically passed away. At that point, Tom had to get back in the studio, I think at some point in the next year, and I think he went straight to you just to engineer, but then you quickly turned into a producer and an in-house mixer for a lot of the songs. I'm just curious as to how that relationship evolved. Like, how did you have that in? And then how did a relationship with a band work in terms of you injecting your creativity and Tom and Ilan going to you for creative solutions as well?
Well, what ended up happening is that Ilan joined Angels and Airwaves, and I think it was September, October, November, somewhere around there. And, being a manager, I had told Ilan, like, all right, they just literally wrapped up Love 2. They're going to go and start touring on this record. There's no quote unquote creativity coming from you. I think that you should, offer to remix, the 2 singles, which I think were like Anxiety and Surrender or whatever. And, kind of put your stamp on something that says, not only am I a drummer, but, I kind of come from a little bit of a different world, and offer something to the fans for free that was kind of like, this is Ilan, welcome, and happy to be here, from Ilan. And when Tom heard the 2 remixes, he's like, oh my God, this sounds incredible. Like, who'd you do this with, Ilan? And he's like, it was me and my brother, like in our studio. He's like, are you kidding me? And, Tom at some point had told Ilan, or, maybe he had told me, I'm not sure. It was just kind of like, hey, it'd be great for you to do like a few songs on the next record, have Critter do a few songs, you do a few songs. And that way we have some, little bit of a wider net sonically on our record. Like, and I was like, yeah, that'd be awesome. And at that point, he's like, well, in the meantime, why don't you guys like do more remixes, like anything off of Love 1 and 2, and then here are these like score pieces that I think would be cool to kind of have Ilan embellish and then, you know, create more for, if you will. And that ended up turning into Stomping the Phantom Brake Pedal. And then we get into the beginning of the year, like literally January, and, you know, Tom calls Ilan, tells him what happened with Critter. And his first comment was like, I've always had like a guy, whether it's Jerry Finn or Critter or whatever, and it's just I need to have that one person in my life or whenever I record, like, who do you think can do this here in San Diego? Like, is there somebody in your wheelhouse? And Ilan was like, yeah, Aaron can do it. I mean, that's what he does for me, and I think he'd do a great job with this. And Tom's like, okay. And at that point, we started working on the score pieces, and the end of Diary, when the vocals come in, was kind of like my first time working with Tom in the studio. And it was, you know, Ilan, Tom, and I believe. Yeah, it was just probably the three of us. And we knocked out that, you know, that last little bit of Diary, and Tom was just like, this is amazing. Like, it sounds like Angels, but it sounds nothing like Angels. But there's so many things in there musically that the sounds harken to that I love. You know, like there's a bit of The Cure in there. There's a bit of Pink Floyd in there. There's a bit of, I don't know. I mean, the drum sound and everything was just so, I mean, we recorded it with like a few mics, and the room mics were like the brunt of the sound, and it was just like super compressed and dirty and whatnot. And he just absolutely loved it. And then we started working on what would become the Dreamwalker soon then thereafter. And, you know, the rest is history. But what's really interesting is that Tom and I pretty much have a lot of the same influences, whether it's, you know, the bands from the 80s that, you know, he always talks about, the Cure, New Order, all of that stuff. And then moving into the whole, like, what was then, like, the new wave punk world, which Lagwagon, NoFX, Descendants, all of that kind of stuff. I, you know, grew up on that stuff as well. From there, it's kind of like we started speaking the same kind of language that Ilan doesn't necessarily have the knowledge of. Like Ilan literally at a certain point only had 10 artists on his, like, at that point, iPod, like, and it was like the Beatles, Led Zeppelin, Queen, The Police, it's like Cream, like those, like the greats are the greats, and he'll have every single thing from those artists, classical composers, whatnots, and it, you know, he's been getting much better from, like, I'd say about 2010 on, getting into, you know, Radiohead and Depeche Mode and Jeff Buckley and, like, all of these other things. But, like, the bands that he listens to for pure joy, if you will, are bands that are A, great, and B, are great at what they do or have something that's great. It's never like, there's no nostalgia thing. Like, we get into, like, the whole punk thing because it's like Southern California and I'm in high school and this is what my friends are listening to. And Ilan never really had that because, I mean, he was literally out of school by the time he was like 14. I mean, sure, he has friends and whatnot, but I mean, he's always been like 14 going on 41. Like, he's just like always been so mature, like beyond his age at whatever point. And I don't know if that's because, you know, he's always been in bands with people who are older than him or what the deal with that is. But I also kind of became like this inherent mediator and translator between Ilan and Tom, because Tom doesn't speak Ilan's language, and Ilan doesn't speak Tom's language. And when they do, it's like if Tom says, "Oh, this Pink Floyd thing," he's referring to a very specific song, and not necessarily a quote unquote macro Pink Floyd sound.
Right.
And that's kind of where we kind of all had to kind of start learning, what are we talking about, what are we going for. Even to this day, like right now on the tour with the Mark Arnold, who was doing front of house for Angels, I told him, I'm like, listen, Tom's gonna come up to you and say, hey, you should definitely like wash this out with reverb, or compress the crap out of this, or make it sound like this or whatever. And I'm like, take those things with a grain of salt, because one of the things that I learned was like, okay, I would take Tom literally with stuff, and then he'd be like, no, that's not it. Or I'm like, okay, you want this, not compression. You want a distortion, So it's like you kind of have to figure things out, and it's kind of a warning from me to you, from an audio engineer to an audio engineer. Like, don't take him too literally, and don't be afraid to ask questions as to what specifically. There's times when Tom will say, "Hey, I want you to do this," and I'd be like, give me a reference of like what you're thinking, and he'd be like, oh, the vocal sound on this song, or the guitar sound on this song. And I'm like, okay, great. That to me is a lot easier than to somehow trying to read his mind and him using the words of what he thinks he's saying, but he's not saying.
So just piggybacking off of that, I just want to ask about the process, and I'm sure it's changed a lot since Stomping the Phantom Brake Pedal and Dreamwalker to present. But when it comes to starting with an idea, with I think usually Tom will sketch an idea he likes all the way to a finished song, which I think you and Ilan have really brought so many different kinds of sonics, and even though a song starts with Tom, it ends up as a real fusion of style and sound. How does it get there? Like, is there a process where you wait until it gets to a certain point and then Ilan comes and like reworks the instrumentals, or are you demoing and recording at the same time, or do you finish a demo and then move on to the recording? I'm just curious what that process is like in the studio.
Well, and this is another one of those things that kind of took a little bit of time to figure out. So Tom doesn't write at home, or he may, but it's like he won't sit there and ever come to me with a complete song idea. He might have a riff or a chord progression and an idea, and then the song builds from there. So he literally writes music in the studio, whereas Ilan will literally have a song 80 to 90% sketched out in his mind, at least musically, and then go and record, put vocals on something and then finish. And that's kind of what I've been used to as far as any bands that I've worked with or been in or whatever. It's usually like, let's get our stuff together and then go into the studio. Tom doesn't do that, and it took me a while to start figuring out, like, I can get the best guitar tone in the world when we're getting these ideas going, but I can come into the studio tomorrow and Tom's like, all right, I'm going to do a completely new chord progression and whatnot. So it took me a little bit of time to like figure out nothing is ever 100% in songwriting, and having to be able to like catalog things in a way where we work on something on a Tuesday and it all changes on Wednesday. It then changes again on Thursday, and he says, okay, I don't like what we did. Let's start over from what we did on Tuesday. And then, bring in another session. So little by little, I started figuring out I have to try to keep as much of the stuff as possible in the box. So those who kind of know what that means, I'll explain it. In the box is just pretty much using stuff within the computer. So, amp plugins in the computer, synth plugins, soft synths and whatnot in the computer. We'd always have a drum set mic'd and ready to go, and we'd have, an input for synths, guitars, and bass ready to go. But we would record everything DI, which is direct input. And what that is just literally the sound of the guitar completely naked. Like,
Right.
it sounds like the cleanest of the clean. And then later on within the box, or if I wanted to reamp and like run that guitar through real amps, because that part's going to stay, I have the ability to do that. And, you know, I can sit there and hone in the proper sound without ever needing Tom or Ilan or whatever there, once we kind of get close. And that's kind of where we started going, and that offered us the best solution for how Tom works and how Ilan works with Tom. So we'd have continuity of sound, and it wasn't like a different guitar sound for the chorus versus the verse or whatever. And that gave me the opportunity to not have to be sitting there worrying about quote unquote engineering as much, like moving mics around, getting the best sounds and whatnot, and kind of just keep the show going creatively and start getting these songs written and whatnot. And it also was a good tool for when Ilan would add kind of, you know, Tom would leave and then he'd be like, all right, take out all the guitars and the bass and let me just jam along with his vocal and kind of see if I can come up with a progression that is a little bit more different, or bring something to the table.
So it seems very like inspiration based and like instinct. Wherever it feels the song needs to go, you'll kind of just hop in and change things around wherever you guys feel like they need to go.
Yeah, I mean, Tom will, you know, we'll bounce something at the end of the day, and he'll listen to that 100 times between the day we worked and the next session. And then, yeah, he's very much a feeling person. Like, he needs to be, a part needs to move him, a lyric needs to move him, a sound needs to move him and put him in a space. And if those things aren't happening in the initial thing, then, you know, it's like, let's change it or come up with something better. Now, conversely, the same thing happens with me. If I start hearing something and I'm just like, all right, the verse is great, but the chorus is just not happening, and it's kind of a letdown by the time we get there. It's like, you know, Tom, we got to change this. And much to my surprise, working with somebody who sold 30 million records and me being a guy who sold, you know, 1,000 at that point, probably 1,002 now, but he was very receptive to any sort of critique or comments that I would have, and there was no ego, which was incredible. And, you know, something I really respect about Tom, because all he cares about is getting the best product, making the song the best it could possibly be, which is why, like, I'd always get bummed out when he'd, like, post something online, like a video on Instagram, like, super early in the process, because I'm just like, you know that this, you're going to change this 600 times. And what starts happening, especially with now how people are on social media, is that, you know, the wolf pack comes out and they're like, dude, the original chorus was better. And it's like, is it better, or is that just what you've been used to because you've been like looping those 50 seconds of audio for the last 3 months, and now you're so used to that melody that the other melody was like, this is so weird. I didn't like this. I'm not used to this. You know, whereas if somebody hears something for the first time, it's like, ooh, this is great, or this is not great. It's not like, oh, it's not like what I had heard before or whatever. So, long story short, I think I would say how Ilan and Tom work, and something that we discovered early on in the process, is that Tom's ear is, you know, melodically, what he can put melodies over are the chord progressions that he pretty much writes. If Ilan wrote a chord progression that Ilan thought was great, Tom would hear it and be like, I don't even know what to put over this. Like, it just doesn't even make sense to me.
Right.
And that's kind of when Ilan said, you know what, you come up with the initial seed of the idea, and then I'll either, you know, work with you as you're like working on it, or I'll come in 2 days once you have a better idea of what you're doing, and then kind of like add my 2 cents. And, what starts happening is that Ilan's then able to put the kind of chord progressions that he likes behind Tom's vocals, which Tom probably wouldn't have been able to put vocals over had Ilan come in there with those sets of chords or whatever. And then Tom hears that and he's like, oh my God, now this gives me a ton of other ideas. And it's kind of just like everybody, it's like that thing where people stack their hands on top of each, one at a time. And it's like
Yeah.
this giant mountain of hands. And that's kind of where the song ends at a certain point where we're just like, all right, this is it. This is done. There's nothing else to add on there, and we're all good. But sometimes we'll get to the end of the thing and just be like, that didn't work. And, trying to figure out where things went wrong and then build upon the things that were right in the song and go with that. But there hasn't been too many of those. But yeah, Tom and the other thing too is that, with the Dreamwalker, we were also writing over such a long process because Tom was doing stuff with, I don't know if he was doing any Blink stuff around then or not.
Live shows, I think.
Yeah, there were live Blink shows going on, and Ilan had Nine Inch Nails going on during that time as well. So, we literally lived with a lot of those songs over 2 years, and, something that you may have written in the beginning of 2013, by the time you get to it in, the spring of 2014, you're like, either you're sick of it or you think that you've written something better for it. So at some point, I had to be like, all right, why are we changing this? Is it because are you sick of the melody, or you just don't think it's strong enough? And really grilling them on that. But I think, as far as Tom and I working together, there's one trait that Ilan and I both have, and it's that we're brutally honest. And it's like I can't even lie to you and tell you, oh yeah, man, that's awesome, great, yeah, let's keep going.
Right.
It's like you're killing it. Like Tom will know, like, all right, you're lying to me, and I'm like, yeah, this is not very good. And he'll be like, okay, what don't you like about it? And we'll have these conversations, and he'll be like, all right, well, let's change it and see where it goes and see where it's better. And I'll be right a lot of the times, and there'll be times when I'll say no to an idea of his. I'm like, no, I don't think it's a good idea. In case in point, something that I can pull to from memory was the post-chorus of Kiss and Tell. Originally, it was just him screaming that line. And I thought, okay, that's kind of cool. And then he added kind of the more melodic harmony thing. And he laid it down, and I was like, no, I don't think this is good. And then as I just kept on listening more and more, I'm like, no, this is right. And then Tom flips on it, and he's like, yeah, I don't know if I like that anymore. I'm like, no, Tom, like, it's good. I was wrong. I now feel like that really wraps a nice bow around the song to make it all cohesive. Because not only did we add those harmonies, we started bringing in the synth from the intro. And I'm like, now we're marrying the intro with the rest of the song. And it doesn't just feel like this intro that came after the fact. Because the intro was just a musical piece before. And it was just supposed to be this Angels and Airwaves, minute intro that, it's just there for atmosphere, but doesn't really do much to the song. And then he came in with the vocal melody, and I was like, oh, that's awesome. But then I'd hear the intro vocal melody in the rest of the song, and I'm like, the two kind of don't marry. I mean, we got this kind of like all these harmonies and melodies and counter melodies going on in the intro, and then the rest of the song vocally is just kind of like your traditional, pop rock song or whatever. And little by little, we started massaging it, and it wasn't until literally the last day that we worked on it and added these little bits and bobs that I felt the song really came together. But that was a point where something that I initially said no to quickly was the right move. and me telling him like, you were right, like dropping my ego the same way he drops his, I think kind of keeps us both honest. And you're working with each other for the greater good, as opposed to some people just coming in and wanting to put their thumbprint on stuff. And I think you start seeing that on a lot of songs these days, where bands more and more are working with songwriters and other artists doing features, and people just start messing and tweaking things for the sake of putting a thumbprint on it. And I don't believe in that. My philosophy is, all right, what's the song and what's going to serve the song the best? Whether it's instrumentally, sonically, we can say that composition is one of those things. Like if we have a really great, sweet song, why do we need this massive intro in front of it?
Right.
If it's just supposed to be this like short little ditty that's like true and tried to itself,
And that's something that's interesting to me, looking at the discography that's come from the last 7 years. In your tenure with Angels and Airwaves, you have stuff like The Dreamwalker, and then you have Chasing Shadows and Of Nightmares and the acoustic EP, or, the remixes and the score pieces you did at first. It's been hard to pin down a specific sound. Like you working with the group seem to have a massive malleability of genre and tone. And I'm wondering, like, where do you find inspiration for that? How do you know how to attack, like the Chasing Shadows EP that's very much progressive punk rock and not a lot of programming, and then also do something like the remix or score pieces or the Dreamwalker, and you're mixing a lot of this, you're programming, engineering a lot of this. I mean, that's got to be like, you got to have an incredible library to pull from of sounds to make that happen, right?
Yeah, I mean, I have my go-tos when it comes to program sounds. Sometimes it's just a sound that I hear in my head as, we're looping stuff over and over and over. Sometimes it's just like, I'm just going to literally go through 1,000 sounds until one pops out to me and says, I'm the guy. And, you go through it like that. But even though me and Tom share a lot of influences, I also have my, things that I love musically, like, and people that I like production-wise or mixer-wise and whatnot, and, the sonics and sounds that they come up with. Or even if it's something that I hate, but I'll hear a sound and be like, I really like the way those drums sound, or that guitar sounds great. And, those things aren't necessarily, they aren't necessarily on their own something that's special, but you start bringing these sounds and ideas and thoughts together with something that Tom has, and it's like, interesting. And Tom knows this too, but Tom tends to repeat himself melodically sometimes, and my whole thing was being very aware of that. How do we change certain things so that that melody isn't the same melody as the chorus of Surrender? Or, it could be as gnarly as, a melody from a Blink song, that it's just kind of like that's where his ear tends to go to. So, my job has always been like, hey, how can we take this and give it a little bit of a new spin so that it doesn't sound like something that's been done in the past.
Yeah.
Or I'm not really loving the song in its current instrumentation. How can we take it and make it something special that's new or different? And then sometimes it's just, fuck it. This is going to be an Angels and Airwaves song with the, dotted eighth note delay and these pads and this sort of drum sound, and that's what's best serving. One of the songs that I can kind of like hearken to with that was Teenagers and Rituals, where we have a lot of the elements of Angels and Airwaves in there. We have the delay guitars, we have the soaring synths, we have, the modernity of the electronics that are in there, but it's still kind of now different. Why? Because it's Ilan writing guitar riffs with these sounds that the Angels fans have been so used to, so it's like, oh yeah, that's the same sound as the guitar riff and the adventure, but now it's a completely different riff that they might not even be used to. And, that song to me is like the next step of what Angels and Airwaves was going to be. The way the drums sounded a little bit differently. They weren't so pristine and clean and whatever. It's like, let's get things dirty, a little bit rougher around the edges. Like, let's not worry about things being like a 100% perfect. Let's just make this as, capture the right sounds, the right takes and whatnot. And a big part of that with me was working with Tom on vocals and literally saying, hey, don't pronounce that word like that, pronounce it like this. So he's like, so take the Tom out of it. And I'm like, yeah, in essence. But coming from somebody who did grow up with Blink and going like, oh man, if he just would have said this word like differently, this whole thing about like yed instead of head is something that me and Ilan would just bust his balls with, and to the point where he would look back and just laugh at it. I was like, yeah, I mean, that's me, but it's one of these things that is funny, but at the same time, like, he does have his own character to his voice and to the way he pronounces words, but it's something like, all right, let's just, mellow it out a bit and then let it kind of stand up when it needs to stand up and let it sit down when we don't really need that, coming to it. And I think to that point, it's like, hey, Tom, I'm also don't want to sit here and auto-tune the shit out of you. And it's like, let's pick up the words, let's pick up the line, let's put in the effort, like, let's get it done. And a lot of the times you'd be like, oh my God, I hate doing this and it's so stupid and blah, blah, blah. And then you'd hear the final result and be like, fuck, this is awesome. I sound great. And I'm like, yeah. And we didn't even have to sit there and auto-tune a bunch of stuff and get it crazy. That's not to say that we don't use auto-tune, because sometimes I just like the inflection or the way he said somebody or something in the attitude, and it's like slightly out, and it's like, all right, let's just bring it to, because that to me sometimes is just as important as pitch.
A special thanks to Angels and Airwaves producer Aaron Rubin for joining us on this debut episode of the AVA Movement interview series. Keep an eye out for part 2 of this interview, which will be released in the coming days. Also, be sure to check out the AVA Movement's new monthly podcast, where we discuss all things AVA, To the Stars, and Tom DeLonge. And keep your eye on the horizon for upcoming AVA Movement interviews. In the meantime, I'm your host, Adam Barnard, and I'll see you next time.